Fugitives wanted by the FBI don't often spend very long on the run. Especially in today's day and age, it's difficult for anybody to hide from authorities for very long. Those who do spend years as fugitives and end up becoming famous through TV shows like America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries, which only makes it even harder for them to go unnoticed. These criminals managed to last longer than most fugitives, but were eventually caught by the FBI and other law enforcement authorities. Number 10. Fans of the TV show Real Housewives of New Jersey might recognize Abzal Khan as Bobby Khan, the charming luxury car dealer who could always get his clients what they wanted. He was also the center of one of the strangest FBI fugitive cases in recent years. For decades, luxury cars have been a favorite symbol of wealth and glamour. Supercars from Europe have an added layer of mystique and have been popular in the US since the end of the war. Being able to import the latest Ferrari or Bentley was a way of boasting about that wealth and looking good while doing it. Over the years, many Europeans have set up dealerships to bring these luxury cars to US customers. And that was what Abzal Khan intended to do when he moved to the US more than 20 years ago. Khan was born in Edinburgh to Pakistani parents and quickly picked up a talent for sales. When he opened the Emporio Motor Group dealership in 2013, he boasted that he'd been selling luxury cars since he was 18. He fit the image of what a supercar dealer was supposed to look like, and he seemed to be very good at his job. In that same interview in 2013, he explained that his dealership was like a Gucci or Fendi store. He worked with millionaires and billionaires to get them the cars that had waiting lists to buy. Among those wealthy customers were the cast of The Real Housewives of New Jersey. But not all was as it seemed behind the scenes at Emporio Motor Group. A lot of Khan's clients would have to take out loans to purchase the cars he advertised. Khan would take out the loan in their name, but never deliver the car or the money. He would write checks for these banks, only for them to bounce when the banks tried to reclaim their money. Would-be buyers were left having to pay back money they'd never seen and without a car. Other people would get cars, but they didn't receive the correct documents with them. Neither Khan nor the Emporio Motor Group had these documents, so the customer was left with a car they couldn't register or drive. Many of those cars actually belonged to other customers. When someone wanted to sell their luxury car, Khan helpfully offered it out to them. But he would never tell the seller that their vehicle had been sold, and simply took all of the money for himself. By September of 2014, customers and banks had had enough of the deception, and the authorities became involved. The police and FBI agents went to Khan's home in New Jersey, but he'd already realized that his scheme had been found out. He'd fled the scene, taking his wife and children with him. His brother, who was employed at the dealership, was arrested and faced charges for his alleged part in the scheme. The FBI added Khan to their most wanted white-collar criminals list. In their wanted poster, they stated that Khan had connections to the UK, Pakistan, and UAE. Strangely, in 2019, Khan offered to hand himself in, but claimed that prosecutors wouldn't allow it. He and his wife gave an interview on Fox News, where he claimed that they were hiding out in a country that didn't have an extradition treaty with the US. They'd apparently outstayed their visas, which would have led to his wife and children getting in a lot of trouble. Khan's wife, Stephanie, talked about how difficult it was for them to live on the run, and said that her children hadn't been to school in 5 years because they were on the run. Khan said that he would hand himself in if the US could bring his wife and children home. Less than a year later, in February of 2020, Khan handed himself into the authorities in the UAE, where he'd apparently been hiding out. He later pleaded guilty and was handed 2 years in prison for wire fraud. Number 9. A criminal who'd been wanted by the FBI for decades was caught after a woman watching the TV show Unsolved Mysteries recognized her neighbor as the man responsible for an attack in 1977. William Claiborne Taylor had been missing since 1980. 3 years earlier, he'd been involved in an ambush that had claimed the life of a 64-year-old man and severely wounded a 77-year-old. The intended victim of the attack was Eugene T. Bailey, the former mayor of Williston, Florida. According to his family, Eugene was a well-liked man who was happy to talk with anybody. Despite a life of politics, he didn't seem to have any enemies. On the night of January 8, 1977, he was out with a group of friends. It included a retired INS customs official named Walter Harry Scott, 2 other men, and their wives. After an evening out at a restaurant, the group went to their cars, only to discover that Walter's car had a flat tire. While the men went to a garage to fix the tire, they sent their wives home in another car. It took about half an hour, but by 9:30 p.m. they were on their way home. Walter was driving, as it was his vehicle, while Eugene took one of the back seats. They took US Route 27 west. After they reached a rural area, another car pulled up alongside them. The passenger fired a weapon through the rear window. A bullet struck Walter and the car was sent off the road into the wooded area along the side. The attackers pulled up behind them and a man in a mask climbed out. He shooed the other 2 men away, then attacked Eugene. He was struck with 3 bullets at close range, but miraculously managed to survive. The other 2 men managed to flag down a truck and called the police, but by the time they arrived, the criminals had disappeared. All they left behind was the bullets they had used, a small address book, and the devastation they had caused. For years, the identity of the attackers remained a mystery. Eugene's family and friends couldn't think of anyone that would want to hurt him. It was clear that he was the intended victim of the attack. Walter, who'd passed away instantly, had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. In April of 1980, the investigation got its first promising lead. A woman came forward to say that she'd overheard her boyfriend, Paul Allen, talking about the incident with another man, Raymond Ellis Taylor. She also said that not long after the attack, she and Allen had gone fishing, and he dumped the weapons used in the lake. A search of the lake turned up nothing, but it turned out scuba divers had already located these weapons and handed them in to the police. An analysis matched them with the bullets left behind. Allen was brought in and confessed to driving the car, but he claimed that Ray's brother, William Clay Taylor, had been the man with the weapon. The scheme had been planned by Ray, who was Eugene's business attorney. Ray was struggling for money and believed that the Bailey family would make him the executor of the estate when Eugene passed away. He just wanted that to happen sooner rather than later, so he orchestrated the plot. The Taylor brothers were also brought in. Despite being the person who actually took Walter's life, Clay Taylor was released on bail and promptly disappeared. For decades, Taylor remained at large. He was added to the FBI's list of wanted criminals, and the case gathered a lot of attention. While Allen and Ray Taylor were both convicted for their parts in the plot, Clay Taylor's case appeared on Unsolved Mysteries. This would be his undoing, as in 2016, a viewer of the show recognized him as her neighbor. Jay Mannion had been living a quiet life for over 30 years. He was married and settled down in Reidsville, North Carolina. There were some oddities about him, like the fact he refused to use his social security number and didn't sign documents very often. But he didn't seem that out of the ordinary. But a scar on his knee and his overall appearance was enough to convince the viewer that he was the person the FBI was looking for. Mannion denied being Clay Taylor, but fingerprints proved that was false. In 2018, he faced trial and was later sentenced to life in prison. Number 8. It had been an ordinary day in November of 2015 when a violent crime spree sent the community of Lakewood, Colorado into a panic. 3 dangerous criminals had already held up a bank, locked everyone there in the vault, and wounded 2 people as they tried to make their escape. Within days, 2 of the men would be found, but the 3rd person involved managed to escape justice until the FBI put him on their most wanted list. The crimes of Milo Jackary Mason and his gang of criminals actually started over a month before the events of November 18th. It started on the morning of September 30th, around 9 a.m. A man in a skeleton mask walked into a convenience store brandishing a weapon. He demanded the terrified shoppers and staff get down on the floor. Nobody was hurt, but 2 bullets were fired into a wall. The criminal left without doing any more damage, and the bewildered staff contacted the police. It was the 2nd call about a violent criminal in a mask that they would receive that morning. At the nearby U.S. Bank, 2 men had burst into the lobby. They were wearing ghoulish masks resembling the villains from the Scream horror films, and also carrying weapons. They threatened the bank staff, one actually climbing onto the desk to menace the teller. A large sum of money was handed over, and the two men fled the scene in a stolen Jeep. The police and the FBI were certain that these two incidents were connected. They believed the attack on the convenience store had been to distract the police from the events at the bank, which had been the real target. Nobody was seriously wounded during either incident, but the police believed that was only because the victims had done as they were instructed. The men were considered armed and dangerous, and the public was warned not to approach them. On November 18th, an eerily similar incident would occur at First Bank. This time, all three individuals wearing the scream masks attacked the bank. The staff and customers were forced into the vault, where the criminals locked them inside before stealing $50,000 and fleeing in an SUV. Unfortunately for the criminals, and for three innocent people just trying to go about their day, the SUV didn't get them very far. The car became stuck in a ditch and was abandoned. Looking for another vehicle, the group attacked a man who was walking out to a van parked outside of his home. This man was attacked and struck with a bullet before the robbers stole his vehicle. Whether out of carelessness or in a panic about the change of plan, the thieves then crashed the vehicle and had to set off in search of a third. Their next victims would be two women in a car outside of a recreation center. These women put up a fight and were also attacked. One lost a finger after being struck in the hand with a bullet. But despite their wounds, the women held on and the criminals had to flee the scene on foot. By this time, the police were hunting for them, and it wasn't long before they found the first of the three hiding under a school bus. This was Miguel David Sanders. The incident was one of the most violent robberies in Colorado, and it made headlines in the local area. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't long before a tip led the police to Tyrone Richardson, but the third member of the gang, Mason, remained elusive. Just a month after the attack, Mason was added to the FBI's most wanted list. There were theories that he might have fled to Florida, where he had ties. A reward of $100,000 for tips was offered. The appeal for information worked. On January 15th, Mason was located at a motel in Thornton where he was captured. All three men were found guilty at trial, and Mason was sentenced to 1,200 years in prison for his spree of crimes. Number 7. Patty Mitchell was a Canadian bank robber, escape artist, and master of disguise who became one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives in 1990. He spent more than a decade on the run before being caught and finally being put behind bars for good. Mitchell's crime spree had started in the 1970s when he became the leader of the so-called Stopwatch Gang. The gang was made up of Mitchell, Stephen Reed, and Lionel Wright. They stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from banks across Canada and the US and earned their name from the stopwatch that Reed wore around his neck. They prioritized speed in their heists. The goal was to get in and out in less than 2 minutes, which was what the stopwatch was for. Their first downfall would come in 1974 when they teamed up with a staff member at the Ottawa airport to steal $750,000 worth of gold from the airport. Authorities quickly figured out it was an inside job and had a suspect in mind. Their accomplice, Gary Coutanche, then worked with police to bring in the Stopwatch Gang. Mitchell was sentenced to 20 years in prison for his crimes, but he wouldn't stay there long. Using nicotine from cigarettes, he was able to fake a heart attack. The ambulance was intercepted by Reed and Wright, who'd already escaped, and the Stopwatch Gang was free again. They resumed their work as bank robbers. In September of 1980, they robbed the San Diego Bank of America in what was then the largest bank robbery ever committed in California. It would again be another accomplice that allowed the police to catch the group. Donnie Hollingsworth had been helping the gang ever since they first broke out of prison, but he was now under investigation for producing illegal substances. When the police closed in on him for that, he agreed to help bring in the Stopwatch Gang in return for leniency. On October 31st, 1980, the police went to an Arizona hideout that Reed and Wright had been renting. They were arrested and brought in, but Mitchell wasn't with them. Despite his two accomplices being behind bars, Mitchell didn't slow down and continued to rob banks across Florida, Arkansas, and Arizona. He used a succession of fake identities, so when he was caught during a botched job in 1982, the authorities didn't realize who exactly they were dealing with. At first, the judge granted him bail, and Mitchell immediately tried to flee. He was soon caught and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mitchell would serve approximately 3 years of that sentence before escaping again. This time, he and 2 other inmates were on janitorial duty when they managed to sneak out through an air conditioning duct. The escape was like something from a Hollywood film and allegedly involved crawling through a duct above the warden's office. They had civilian clothes prepared and simply walked out of the facility. Mitchell and his fellow escapees went their separate ways. He moved to the Philippines, where he started a new life with a new wife and son. But over the next 15 years, he would periodically return to the US, where he continued to rob banks. He was unaware of the attention he'd been getting, or that he had appeared on TV shows like Unsolved Mysteries. His victims were now aware of his tactics. On at least one occasion, he'd called the police to report a threat at a location in the same district as his target, which meant they were busy when he robbed the bank. He attempted the same trick again on February 22, 1994. This time, though, the police chief suspected a trap. When a threat was called in on City Hall, he sent police cars to all the banks in the area. Even though Mitchell spent less than a minute inside the bank during his robbery, when he walked out, the police were waiting for him. Mitchell was given 2 30-year sentences and claimed his escape days were behind him. But the authorities soon learned of an escape plan, and in May of 1995, he was given another 5 years in prison for plotting to escape. Mitchell spent the rest of his life behind bars. Number 6. Many FBI cases involve working with foreign governments to bring fugitives to justice, and that also works with foreign fugitives who are at large in the United States. That was the case with Kol Lulzari, who was caught in the US after 4 years on the run from authorities in the UK. For more than 10 years, Lulzari had worked as a financial advisor. His role often involved him working with elderly clients who were looking at their life savings and how to manage them now that they had retired. Lulzari was described as suave and charming, and his clients had no problem putting their trust in him. Little did they know he was funneling their savings into his bank account so they could fund his own lifestyle. The scheme worked for a decade before the daughter of one of his victims realized something was wrong. The daughter had been talking to the bank about how they could manage fees for her mother's home care when they noticed a discrepancy. This started an investigation that found countless other victims around the area. Some had passed away without ever realizing that Lulzari had stolen thousands from them. In 2012, he was arrested for his crimes but was released on bail. As soon as he was released, he took the Eurostar to France before flying to Canada and then on to Michigan in the US. The exact timeline of his flight from the law isn't clear, but he spent a reasonable amount of time in the US. He seemed to be starting his life again and had apparently forgotten all about his victims in the UK. In total, he'd stolen almost £1 million from his victims, who were left with few options even when the fraud and theft were discovered. A local news outlet, the Northern Echo, published a story about his crime online. In it, they explained that the police believed he'd fled the country, but had little information on where he could be. Meanwhile, Lulzari had recently started a new job at a bank in Michigan. As part of the security checks, someone at the bank ran a Google search of his surname, which turned up the Northern Echo article. The bank suspended Lulzari as they investigated the case. He claimed it was all a misunderstanding, but he didn't realize his employers had also contacted the authorities. FBI agent John Cecchini took the case. Even though fraud and white-collar crime investigators were uninterested in the case, he continued to work to try to bring Lulzari to justice. Authorities in the UK were contacted, and the FBI arrested Lulzari at his home. He was brought back to the UK, where he was found guilty of 6 counts of theft and 1 count of fraud. And after years on the run, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Number 5. Hakan Ayek is a career criminal whose life of crime led to him being wanted around the world, including by the FBI in the US. He also helped the FBI to capture countless other individuals. Ayek was born in a working-class neighborhood in Sydney, Australia. He became involved in crime at a young age, and his brother and cousin both did stints in prison. He would later become known as the Facebook gangster as he bragged about his crimes and lifestyle over social media. Unsurprisingly, that led to him attracting the attention of the police, and he left Australia for Cyprus. In 2010, He was arrested there before being granted bail and disappearing. He would be added to Australia's Most Wanted after this. At some point, he became involved with the Comanchero Motorcycle Club, one of the most notorious organized crime groups in Australia and Southeast Asia. The gang has been responsible for various violent crimes, as well as transporting illegal substances into Australia. Between 2018 and 2022, a man named Mark Buttle managed the gang, but when Buttle was arrested in 2022, the leadership fell to Ayek. Ayek was already known as an influencer in criminal circles. He'd been identified as such by the FBI when they were planning to launch the Anam software. One of the biggest problems authorities faced when trying to tackle organized crime is the encrypted software that these groups use to communicate. Rather than trying to crack into other software, the FBI developed their own version, named Anam. This was distributed unknowingly by the very criminals they were trying to catch. An undercover agent would give a device encrypted with Anam to an influential member of the community, who would then acquire more devices for their associates and others. The FBI and its partners were then able to read messages sent between these devices in real time. The scheme had been successful in tracking down countless individuals and stopping crimes before they happened. Ayek was one of the people initially introduced to Anam, and he went on to introduce hundreds of other criminals to the network, essentially helping the FBI to track them. When the Anam initiative came to an end, Ayek was charged in an FBI indictment and his involvement was made public. Law enforcement officials encouraged Ayek to hand himself in for his own safety. Although he hadn't known it at the time, he'd led to many dangerous criminals being caught. The authorities believed there was a chance that they would try to enact their revenge. But Ayek didn't listen to these warnings. By this point, authorities knew he'd moved to Turkey, where his parents had been born before migrating to Australia. He continued to live the lavish lifestyle he was known for there, purchasing expensive luxury cars and owning 2 houses while he managed the Comanchero gang. His time evading authorities would come to an end in November of 2023, when Turkish authorities arrested him and 36 other individuals who they described as being part of an international armed organized crime group. As Ayek is wanted for crimes in multiple countries, it's not clear what'll happen to him now, but authorities are keeping a close eye on him to make sure he doesn't escape again. Number 4. On February 9th, 1993, Mir Emal Kanzi was added to the FBI's Most Wanted list, becoming the 435th person on the list. Just days earlier, FBI agents had realized he was the man responsible for a horrifying crime outside the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The crime had occurred at around 8 a.m. on the morning of January 25th, 1993. Staff at the CIA's headquarters were just arriving at work. Among them were Lansing Bennett, a 66-year-old physician and intelligence analyst, and Frank Darling, a covert operations employee. They were driving separate cars and joined the queue of cars stopped at the red light before the final turn into the headquarters entrance. It was a route they would have done countless times before, but this time there was someone in that line of cars that wasn't an employee. An individual nobody recognized climbed out of a station wagon and began firing at the CIA employees. A total of 11 bullets were used. The criminal would later admit he continued to attack until there were no more men in his sights. He didn't believe the female employees had any power in the US. In a matter of minutes, these people just waiting to go to work were now severely wounded, or in the cases of Lansing and Frank, no longer alive. The culprit fled the scene in his vehicle before the police and FBI arrived. When the FBI did arrive, it wasn't immediately clear if this was a random incident, or if someone had deliberately wanted to attack CIA employees. The investigation began by looking into weapons purchases in Virginia and Maryland. They found that an individual had swapped one weapon for something more dangerous just days before the attack. The buyer was Mir Emal Kanzi. The authorities went to the apartment Kanzi was living in to find that he hadn't been there since the day of the attack. The only person there was a man named Zahed Mir. According to Zahed, he and Kanzi were 2 of 4 men who lived on and off at the apartment, but the other 2 individuals weren't living there at the time of the crime. Zahed hadn't seen Kanzi since January 22nd, the day Kanzi had purchased the weapon. They'd gone to the mosque together, and on the way, Kanzi had stopped at the weapons store. After they returned from the mosque, Zahed went to work. He didn't know where Kanzi was. When the police searched the home, they found the weapon used in the attack. Piecing together information discovered later on, the authorities learned that Kanzi had waited in the woods for hours after the attack, thinking the police would come after him. When they didn't, he returned to his home to hide his weapon, before going to McDonald's for food. He asked a friend for a one-way ticket to Pakistan and waited at a motel for his flight the following day. By the time the FBI identified him as the culprit, he was already out of the country. That didn't stop the FBI from announcing him as a fugitive, and days later, as one of their most wanted. Over the next few years, the authorities received many tips from people in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but none panned out. It wouldn't be until May of 1997 that they finally got the tip they needed. Kanzi was hiding out in Pakistan near the border with Afghanistan. An informant provided the FBI with the photograph and glass containing his fingerprints. They were able to use those to determine that this was actually Kanzi. He was arrested on June 15, 1997, and transported back to the United States, where he was found guilty of his crimes. Number 3. On May 17, 1991, a small article appeared in the Shreveport Times with the headline, "Man Guilty but Doesn't Wait to Hear It." This was the start of a manhunt that would last over 30 years and make headlines around the world. The man in question was Greg Lawson, who was 31 years old at the time. According to residents in Ringgold, Louisiana, Lawson was a bully known for having a temper. Lots of people had stories about times they'd come up against Lawson, but his family allegedly had influence and he didn't seem to get into any trouble for these incidents. That was until April 24, 1990. According to some sources, Seth Garlington was a childhood friend of Lawson, even though he was 9 years younger. They had known each other for a while, though. 3 days before the incident Lawson became famous for, he was involved in an accident where he attacked Seth, John Moses Garlington, and Jeff Robinson. He also fired a bullet into a mobile home owned by a woman named Debbie Moore. Whether the incident was reported at the time, or if the victims thought this was just another one of Lawson's outbursts that he'd get away with, is unclear. He was still at large on April 24th when he encountered Seth while driving. He tried to force Seth's car off the road, and when they stopped at a gas station, a physical fight broke out. It started with just their hands, but Lawson and his victim both pulled out weapons. Lawson fired and Seth was struck. Seth Garlington was taken to an intensive care unit and miraculously managed to survive his wound. In the meantime, an arrest warrant was issued against Lawson for both of his actions on the 21st of April and the attempt on Seth's life on the 24th. Despite trying to disappear, Lawson was arrested and charged for the crimes. A little over a year later, Lawson stood trial for his crimes. It took the jury just half an hour of deliberation to find him guilty of the attacks. But when the jury read their verdict, Lawson was nowhere to be seen. After a search of the court building, law enforcement realized he had fled. His vehicle was found abandoned a few blocks away. The search for Lawson began and the FBI soon became involved. They believed he might have fled the country to Mexico, where there were rumors that he'd gone as far as South America. Locals in Ringgold reported sightings of Lawson in the local area. According to officials, these were more like urban legends than actual sightings, though. Whatever he had done before going on the run, it had left a lasting impact on the community. There were many tips over the years, but it wasn't until 2023 that authorities were finally able to bring him in. Lawson was located in Mexico, where he had allegedly been living for over 30 years. He used the identity of a man from Alabama who had passed away. Exactly how and when people realized Lawson wasn't who he said he was isn't clear, but someone came to the authorities in Mexico with that information. Mexican authorities realized he wasn't just someone living under a fake identity, but a wanted and dangerous fugitive. He was arrested on immigration grounds before being handed over to the U.S. law enforcement so he could face justice for the more violent crimes he'd committed. Lawson was seen laughing as he was taken into the custody of the FBI, but he'll now face the consequences of the actions that he took so long ago. Number 2. For FBI agents and DEA staff, catching Augustin Mendoza was a personal matter. This was the man responsible for the crime that took the life of one of their own. After 4 years on the run, he was finally captured after a small slip-up. Mendoza was the leader of an organized crime group that dealt with illegal substances. Richard Fass was a DEA agent who'd spent his career doing undercover work. June 30th of 1994 was supposed to be Fass's last day as an undercover agent. He was planning to take a desk job, but there was one last meeting he and a fellow agent, Michael Pelonero, had to do first. They went to a garage where they were supposed to be meeting a man who went by the alias of Fernando. The story was that they wanted to buy a large amount of substances with $160,000 in cash. Instead, they were met by two of Fernando's associates. Fass was shown into the garage, where he and two informants were attacked and tied up. The criminals wanted the money and weren't going to hand over anything for it. Fass tried to fight back, so the criminals took his life. The two men who'd been there that day, Rafael Rubio Mendez and Juan Vasquez Rubio, were both arrested, along with a third individual, Eduardo Aceves Vasquez. But the mysterious Fernando, who was actually Augustin Mendez, was nowhere to be found. Mendez was believed to not just be the mastermind of the gang, but the mastermind of this plot in particular. The authorities believed he'd fled to Mexico, but there was little information about what happened after that. Mendez remained an important goal for both the FBI and the DEA. He was added to the FBI's most wanted fugitive list in 1996, and a reward of $250,000 for information was offered. When this didn't work, the award was raised to $2.2 million. Still, little information came in. Many people who looked like Mendez were arrested, but the man himself remained elusive. It turned out that the problem was Mendez had gone completely off the grid. He'd cut contact with all of his old family and friends. He moved to a remote region of Mexico, where he refused to use technology so that there was nothing that could be traced. He also used the name Cornejo, a name of a prominent organized crime family in the area. His neighbors wouldn't want to go up against them, even if they'd wanted to cooperate with authorities and turn Mendez in. Two slip-ups led to him being caught. The first came when he got married. During the wedding, he and his new wife both put their fingerprints on the marriage certificate. The authorities in the US already had his fingerprints on file and were able to match them. The second slip-up was when he started to use a payphone to call members of his wife's family. This wasn't only a single time, and the FBI agents were able to figure out where the phone was by considering the noise in the background of the calls, as well as satellite and ground surveillance. In 2010, Mendez was arrested while he was still on the phone. It took 5 years before he was extradited to the US, but in 2006, he was found guilty of ordering the attack on Richard Fass and was given a 70-year prison sentence. Number 1. Kevin Mitnik was one of the first computer hackers to become famous around the world, and one of the most wanted computer criminals of the 1990s. Just as the internet age was beginning to take off, Mitnik was ready to take advantage of the insecure systems designed by people who were still learning what the internet could do. He'd started hacking at a young age. At first, it was just telephones. In the late 1980s, being able to make long-distance calls without being charged for it was something like magic to Mitnik, who'd wanted to be a magician as a child. As he got older, his talents became more advanced. His hacking led to a year in prison as a teenager, but it didn't lead to him mending his ways. In 1992, his hacking activity led to him becoming wanted by the FBI. At the time, exactly what he had done wasn't clear, and there was a lot of sensationalism in the press. The general public wasn't certain what a computer hacker was capable of. After he was caught years later, the prison staff wouldn't let him use the phone, as they believed he could whistle into the receiver and launch a nuclear attack. What is known is that he had illegal access to 20,000 credit card numbers copied from the internet service provider Netcom. Some of these numbers belonged to Silicon Valley moguls. He also caused millions of dollars in damage to corporate computer operations and stole software used for maintaining the privacy of wireless calls and handling billing information. There were allegations that he'd sent company secrets that he'd obtained through hacking to people in other countries, and his actions cost people their jobs. Often, he took a very low-tech approach at first. He would phone employees of the company he wanted to hack and pretend to be a high-ranking official. After winning their trust, he requested passwords or other information that was then handed over. With that, he could go into the systems and get whatever he wanted. While the public was baffled about what he was actually capable of, the FBI and other authorities were equally confused about his motives. There was no evidence he'd actually used any of the information he gathered for financial purposes. It seemed more like he wanted to prove that he could do it. After going on the run in 1992, he used his computer skills to help him evade the FBI agents who were searching for him. He used a wiretap placed on the agents and a radio scanner to keep one step ahead of them, and to provide false information that always kept them looking in the wrong place. On one occasion, the authorities had discovered the apartment where he was staying, but by the time they got there, all that was left was a box of donuts waiting for them. Mitnik was always one step ahead of the FBI investigators and authorities, and it was only when they got a hacker of their very own that they were finally able to close in on him. Mitnik's mistake was making an enemy of someone actually capable of helping them. On Christmas Day of 1994, he hacked into the email account of Tsutomu Shimomura, a researcher at the San Diego Supercomputer Center. Like with the hacks that led to him becoming a wanted fugitive in the first place, it seemed to be a case of Mitnik just wanting to prove that he could do it. Mitnik taunted Tsutomu, which led to him cutting his Christmas vacation short and offering to help the FBI get the hacker. Tsutomu was able to use software designed to identify the cell tower Mitnik's computer was connected to. Using this and cell phone scanning equipment, the FBI were finally able to track down Mitnik and take him into custody. Mitnik spent 5 years in prison, 4.5 of which was before he even faced trial. When he was released, he was banned from using a computer or cell phone without permission for 3 years. Like a lot of famous hackers, Mitnik went on to use his talents for good, helping companies identify holes in their systems and other vulnerabilities. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.